Welcome to Ruslan Belov's channel. On air is another daily review of the situation on the Ukrainian front. Let's get straight to a detailed analysis of the current situation. Let's start with the Sumy region, since it is here that a new sector of active operations has recently formed, another bridgehead. If I am not mistaken, it is already the fifth in a row. We are talking about the zone along the Russian-Ukrainian border south of the settlement of Grafovka. Let me remind you that back in the summer, Ukrainian units attempted to break through in this area. Battles were fought directly in Grafovka, as well as in Demidovka, and, according to some reports, affected Pakovka. However, all these actions ended in failure for the AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces were pushed out, after which the Russian side managed to consolidate, occupy a small settlement, and form a semblance of a buffer zone, effectively a grey territory. At the same time, it is worth noting that this sector generally does not look promising for either side. There is no developed logistics here, the road network is practically non-existent, and the terrain is cut by rivers and forest massifs. Offensive actions under such conditions are extremely difficult. In essence, Russian units here are solving a different task, stretching the AFU forces. The Ukrainian side cannot simply leave settlements without defense and is forced to transfer personnel here, which in any case weakens other directions. A completely different situation is unfolding further south, in the area of the settlement of Pakovka. Here, the situation is significantly more dynamic. If we rely on current maps, it can be assumed that approximately half of the village is already under Russia's control, and fighting continues. The probability of Pakovka fully passing under the control of Russian forces is quite high, as there appear to be no serious AFU reserves in this area. At the same time, on the Russian side, there is no talk of some massive strike force, yet their forces are likely more substantial than those of the adversary. It is also important that this area is located relatively close to the regional center, the city of Sumy. Furthermore, a road leading in the direction of this city passes through Pakovka. If Russian troops manage to develop their advance along the river and reach Krasnopolye, then Ukraine will face the necessity of an urgent response, transferring reserves and taking additional measures. In general, this fits into the already familiar logic of forming a buffer zone and the strategy of gradual pressure, the so-called thousand cuts tactic. If we speak about bridgeheads in the Sumy region as a whole, they can be conditionally counted. The first is here, the second is in the area of Grafovka. Next follows another fairly large bridgehead, practically devoid of settlements. This is the third. The fourth is the main sector, including about 14 settlements. And quite recently, already this month, a fifth one appeared, right in this area. At the moment, according to available data, there are no other such sectors. However, it is quite probable that their number will grow over time. There is also a zone of grey control in the area of Timonovichi, but most likely this concerns only the operation of drones and not the permanent presence of Russian units. We can end with the Sumy region on this note and move on to the Borovskaya direction, about which a lot of contradictory information has been coming in lately, both positive and negative. Here, the situation is developing as follows. Russian forces managed to advance towards Novaya Krugliakovka. These actions are aimed at liquidating the so-called Boguslavka pocket of the AFU, which continues to be held and has not yet been successfully collapsed completely. However, the Russian side is actively working precisely in this direction, and the process continues. At the same time, unfavorable reports were received the day before. Ukrainian units managed to conduct a counterattack, as a result of which Borovskaya Andreevka, a sufficiently large settlement, according to a number of sources, has again passed under AFU control. According to other data, this village is in the grey zone, and according to yet others, it is still held by the Russian side. Thus, intense combat operations are currently underway in the northern part of the so-called Borovskaya or Borovaya pocket. At the same time, it is unlikely that in the near term Russia plans to force the river with a subsequent offensive, for example, on Izium. However, maintaining constant pressure and tension for the AFU along the entire line of contact remains a key task, which the Russian side is coping with, one way or another. Next is the Slavansk-Kramatorsk direction. Here, Russian units have occupied a number of new positions in the areas of Nikiforovka and Reznikovka. Steady and consistent advances are recorded in the area of Ozernoye, as well as southeast of Fedorovka Vtoraya, 2nd. The RF armed forces are gradually pushing Ukrainian forces out of the grey zone, improving their initial positions and simultaneously stretching the enemy's defense. On the Krasnolimansky sector, work continues on closing the pocket north of Krasny Liman between the settlements of Stavki and Zarekhnoye. Russian units operate in small groups, striving to fragment the enemy's defense and systematically clear separate sectors with the aim of completely collapsing this sack. In the near future, a leveling of the front line between the eastern outskirts of Drobyshevo and Stavki is also expected. After this, it will be possible to speak of a transition to the decisive stage of battles directly for Krasny Liman. The AFU regularly attempts to transfer reserves here via logistical routes passing through the Slaviansk power station. However, this area is under dense fire control of the RF armed forces, where unmanned assets are actively employed. From the southern outskirts of the city, Russian units continue to advance from Dibrova toward the city limits, simultaneously attempting to move west for a partial encirclement of Krasny Liman. Let's move on. We will leave the Pokrovsk direction without review for now and move to the Guli Pole direction, where a rather unpleasant situation is developing. It is understandable that within the framework of video materials, it is impossible to demonstrate Ukrainian military footage. However, I think many have already seen the objective control footage from the settlement of Ternovato. Ukrainian media are actively stating that Ternovato, one of two key points on the defense line stretching from north to south along the railway, has allegedly passed back under AFU control. In the published footage, Ukrainian servicemen are planting their flag at the entrance to the settlement. This, of course, does not mean full control over Ternovato, since with a full occupation, footage from the central part is usually demonstrated. Nevertheless, it is obvious that the situation here is far from unambiguous and clearly not ideal for the Russian side. Furthermore, according to maps, Ukrainian forces managed to advance in a sector that previously belonged to the grey zone. Now this area is no longer such. The advance is estimated at approximately 1.5 kilometers in depth, with a sector width of about 4 kilometers, which is a very significant result for the AFU, given the rarity of their offensive successes. This information comes from Russian sources engaged in mapping combat actions, and it is precisely this that I am demonstrating to you now. Moreover, the Ukrainian side managed to align the defense line along the railway track in the area of Vozdvizhevka. Previously, reports appeared regarding the presence of Russian units in this settlement. However, now, by all appearances, the situation has changed, and Ukraine has managed to stabilize the position. As for Zaliznychnoye, fighting continues there. Russian troops have not yet succeeded in fully establishing control over this settlement. The depiction on some maps looks overly optimistic. Perhaps it corresponds to reality, and perhaps not. On Ukrainian maps, Zaliznychnoye is not designated as a grey zone at all and is considered fully controlled by the AFU, while their front line runs significantly further east, right up to the areas of Guli Pole, which of course does not correspond to the real situation. Therefore, it is worth following the development of events here closely. At the same time, according to the freshest information, Russian units managed to somewhat align the front line and pull up the flanks south of Zaliznychnoye. This indicates fierce meeting engagements, the outcome of which is not yet clear. However, in a strategic perspective, most likely it will be a matter of breaking through this line of defense and reaching the next line. First to the road with engineering barriers and minefields, then to the river, and from there to Orakov remains a relatively short distance. In general, it must be admitted that the pace of the Russian army's advance here is no longer as high as in November to December, which indicates the transfer of Ukrainian reserves and a certain stabilization of the situation on their part. Finally, a few words about broader assessments. The thesis is actively being discussed in the Ukrainian information space that this year Russia will concentrate its main efforts on two directions. The first is the Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkovka axis. This is not something new, however, it is precisely now that Ukrainian media have begun to actively voice this thought. We are talking about an attempt to seize the most powerful and fortified defensive line in the Donetsk region, including the region's largest pre-war cities. The second direction is Zaporozhye. By and large, there is nothing fundamentally new in these assessments. This was already spoken about in my summary editions for 2025 and forecasts for 2026. The main question lies elsewhere. Will Russia limit itself only to these directions or open another serious front of offensive operations? For now, everything points to a concentration of efforts precisely on two major directions. While the Liman, Seversk and Konstantinovka sectors logically fit into the general configuration, as do separate elements of pressure in the Dobropole area and, of course, in the south. In general, it only remains to carefully observe the development of events. Only time will show what all this will lead to. Now let's move on to the political part of the agenda. In London, outright instability is growing. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer increasingly finds himself in a situation resembling the position of Boris Johnson in the summer of 2022. Against the backdrop of scandals connected with the Epstein case, the first resignations have begun to occur in the government. Leaving his post is a key figure in the Labour headquarters, the party's chief advisor and strategist, Morgan McSweeney, who many considered Starmer's pillar of support. Dudikoff reports this. It was McSweeney who played the decisive role in the Labour triumph in the summer of 2024, when the party received more than 400 seats in the House of Commons, achieving a historical victory. However, grievances against him had been accumulating for a long time. The left wing of the party was irritated by the fact that McSweeney was effectively pushing Starmer to borrow Donald Trump's rhetoric and adopt a harder line on the issue of migration. McSweeney's positions were finally undermined by his close contacts with Peter Mandelson. After the Epstein case surfaced, Mandelson began to be accused of practically everything in a row, up to claims about his alleged cooperation with Russia, starting from 2004. At the same time, the key problem lies in the fact that it was Mandelson who participated in forming the current Labour team. Moreover, even some of Starmer's potential successors are his protégés. Discord within the government is intensifying. Even his own ministers are effectively beginning to play against Starmer. Thus, David Lammy, occupying the post of Deputy Prime Minister and previously heading the Foreign Office, allowed a leak of information that he allegedly spoke out against the appointment of Mandelson as UK ambassador to the USA. By all appearances, in the near future, members of the Labour cabinet will begin to leave one after another, which will ultimately lead to the resignation of Starmer himself. The situation is also aggravated by upcoming municipal elections, where, according to forecasts, a crushing defeat awaits Labour. If we move on to Ukraine, then, according to the estimates of our sources, the so-called infrastructure war 3.0, unleashed by Zelensky, will lead to colossal damage. We are talking about destruction in the energy sector, gas production, fuel infrastructure, and business in general amounting to over $30 billion, and possibly significantly more since the escalation continues. All this will directly affect the population's standard and quality of life. The so-called Black Winter for Ukraine will not be limited to the current season. Its consequences will manifest in 2027 as well. The deficit of foreign currency receipts from exports will intensify, and pressure on the state budget will increase. Tariffs and prices will continue to grow, and the banking sector will find itself under the threat of mass bankruptcies. A wave of closures of small and medium-sized businesses is expected already this year. The mortality rate in the country will continue to set anti-records. The housing and utilities sector will degrade at an accelerated pace. Ukraine will increasingly resemble a ruined territory. The outflow of the population will persist, and external sponsors will begin to import cheap labor from countries of Asia and the Middle East. As a result, the country risks turning into a colony of large foreign capital, which is not interested in development, but will merely pump out Ukrainian resources through offshore schemes for a pittance. Against the backdrop of the impoverishment of the population, the crime rate will increase. The healthcare and education systems will continue to degrade rapidly. Capital will continue to be withdrawn outside the country. Corruption will intensify in practically all spheres of public life and the economy. The internal split will deepen, and arbitrariness during mobilization will increase. Lists for forced conscription will expand, since the deficit of personnel at the front will persist. And this is only a small part of the consequences of the policies of Zelensky and the entire so-called Ukrainian elite, which in essence is destroying the last opportunities for the country's survival. Zelensky has already lost the infrastructure war, however, as in the case of the Kursk gamble, he is unable to admit his own mistakes and continues to stubbornly lead the country to collapse, dragging the population down with him. Now about the deal between the USA and India, which in reality turned out to be more of a loud news event than a real breakthrough. The White House announced a long-awaited agreement with New Delhi. Tariffs on Indian imports to the USA are being reduced from 50% to 18%. In return, the Indian side promised to purchase American goods worth $500 billion. True, the fulfillment of these obligations is stretched out over at least 5 years, if they are fulfilled at all. It is enough to recall that neither European countries, nor the states of the Middle East, nor Japan ever invested a single dollar in the US economy, despite promises to Trump to invest trillions. Moreover, in 5 years Trump will long since not occupy the post of president, which Dudikov also points out. It is also notable that despite all tariff measures, India's exports to the USA grew by 16% last year anyway. The fact is that a significant part of Indian goods, including electronics, for example iPhones assembled in India, and pharmaceutical products, effectively did not fall under the tariffs. The new tariff of 18% will also not affect these categories, since without Indian generics and electronics, the American market would quickly face a deficit. At the same time, Trump's team is actively promoting the idea of increasing supplies of American oil to India. However, it will be extremely difficult to realize this, especially against the backdrop of the collapsing shale bubble in the USA. India, for its part, has learned well how to negotiate with Trump. The main thing is to make a loud promise here and now. Executing the agreements is not at all necessary, especially since ahead lies a key decision of the US Supreme Court, which may declare the tariffs unconstitutional and cancel a significant part of them. In that case, the current 18% will simply cease to exist. In any case, only 9 months remain until the congressional elections, and as they approach, Trump will clearly have no time for tariff wars, given the extremely low popularity of these measures among American voters. That is all for today. Thank you for your attention. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest developments. All the best, and see you in the next broadcast.